Hey, I'm Ægir. I work for the SQL Monitor team. I've been here for 2 weeks at Redgate, and on my second day, I made this really innocent comment on Yammer, and that basically turned into this talk today. In the past, I feel like I've been fighting the same things over and over in web development. I've been fighting specificity when I do my CSS and there's already some long selector and I just want to make a little change. I have to be as specific and know all the rules for that. It can be really annoying to have a lot of important styles. Sometimes I want to reuse some code and it's all tied to some ID. And can I put 2 IDs in the page, please? And sometimes really hard to read, hard to find out where the styles are. And sometimes if you make a little change in the markup, just everything falls apart. So enough about the problems. What are the solutions? In the comment I made on Yammer, I talked about BEM. So the main goals of BEM are that you're able to launch your website quickly and they're still easy to maintain in the long run. There's no steep learning curve for new members in the team, and that you keep the UI consistent by reusing code, sharing components. And the reason why I mentioned BEM over some other tool is so you start looking at the 3 fundamental things in creating UI components. That's the block, element, and modifier, what BEM stands for. A block is a single reusable component, and a block can contain elements and the element is still a part of the component, and the block can also contain other separate blocks. And the modifier represents different variations of either an element or a block. Okay. This is an example of a code using the BEM naming conventions. We have a menu, which is the block. We have an item, which is the element. And then, in this case, we have a modifier, which is the state current. We could also have maybe a size, which is big and small, or different kind of modifiers to change the elements. There are a lot of different naming conventions, but the main thing you have to do is to separate the block, element, and the modifier. Have different separators, so when I read this, I can see which is block, which is element, and which is a modifier. Suit is a CSS framework written by NICOLAS GALLAGHER. I met him at CSS Conf this year and talked a lot about those CSS components with him. And that is actually inspired by BEM. So he has his own naming conventions where you have the optional namespace, you have the component name, which is basically a block, and then you have 1 dash for sub-elements and 2 dashes for modifiers. So you look at the class name and you understand better how it works all together. Here's an example. Here we have a button style. And yes, you see casing is actually allowed in CSS. So instead of having dashes to mark different words, he uses Pascal casing for the elements and camel casing for, Pascal casing for the block itself, for the components itself, and camel casing for the elements, sub-elements. So there we have the core button and default theme modifier. And what he does is he takes the states and keeps modifiers and states separate. And the state is always prefixed with is dash. So there we have a tweet, and then we might add some styles when it's actually expanded. So this is a class that JavaScript could be toggling. And it also adds some utility classes prefixed with u-das. Another thing that Suit adds is the ability to style the parent of the component. There we have the component dropdown, and the parent has with das in the name of the component with dropdown, because in this case it needs its parents to be position relative. Okay, and each component is standalone in Suit and are all registered in the Bower package manager, so you could actually just define which components you want and only get them, and not having to get this big CSS file with everything. So what I feel in web development, like the main change the last few years, is instead of making the JavaScript and CSS target the HTML with long selectors, it's kind of going the other way, that HTML is now picking, I want this CSS component, I want this functionality here. So it's kind of easier to work with the markup. In my previous job, we redesigned our main website, and then we used object-oriented CSS and SMAX, or took like ideas from them, which are quite similar, and everything was based on different UI components. And what I really like, that we made this separate components website, basically a website where every UI component was demonstrated, and that web page was just HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and shipped with our static assets. So we have all our assets, all our CSS components in a separate static server, so we could just go into this component web page for the different environments, for dev or live, and see exactly what's there. And it's like a great documentation for newcomers that just need to make this page and see what's available and easily reuse it. And we, in our team, we also had web editors just working with the CMS, putting new pages on the site, and then they could actually just go, hey, I need this component, and do that without the help of a programmer. Yeah. So when we make new components, I prefer to start to go to the component web page and do the markup first, put the class names I want, and then later go in and do the CSS for that. And I kind of feel like I'm doing test-driven development. I'm kind of first defining, okay, the use case, I want to use this UI component like this, and then implement it and do it in the component website before I use it in my ASP.NET web application, because then there's no server-side code or template rendering, there. It's just isolated. I'm just doing this component, focusing on what I'm trying to solve. Yeah, so when I do new web pages today, I actually prefer to just start with like a component web page, do the shared components first, and then just build out the pages. Yeah. And I think that many of those ideas, like doing the UI components and trying to share the code, could be really beneficial to redgate if we are moving to more WebGate UIs, both in like desktop programs and in the website. There's a lot of reuse. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah. Okay.
It looks like you're being quite verbose with the class names there. Like you showed the menu with the UL being saying it was a menu, and then each of the LI items within it being individually labeled as menu items. And I'm kind of wondering what you see as the advantage of doing that over just writing CSS that says, if there's a UL that's a menu and it contains LIs, then those LIs are obviously the menu items.
Yeah, because you want, or what I want is So this is a good question, because this is actually my first feeling when I saw this. Like, what? Why do you have these ridiculous long class names? But when you start actually working with this, you just feel, how better it is if you just see the class name and okay, this is the button element. I go to the button CSS, it's there, and I see it's like more meaningful right there in the HTML. So working in a large team, this scales up much better than be targeting the LI and targeting the UL. If you are afraid of the size, that your markup will come too large, I think that's just an optimization that can come afterwards. We are more thinking about here, how do we want to write CSS? How do we want to write UI components? And I mean, you could have some builds that to, take it all together in the end. Does it answer the question? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't so much the file size I was worried about, because GZip takes care of that.
Yeah.
It's more the sitting there typing those names, and I can see myself doing that and hating it.
Yeah. And then in that cases, you could have like a template for the components and reuse the template.